Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 11th chapter. Galbraith, who needed to catch a British Airways flight, had to spend 2.5 hours at Portland International Airport. The wait didn't promise to be pleasant. By this time, such a crowd had formed in the building that it was completely incomprehensible to the inspector, unfamiliar with local orders, how people would even get on their planes. Leaving his suitcase in one of the waiting rooms, he headed to the second floor, where there were shops and cafes where he could buy a hamburger or coffee. Walking a little forward, Galbraith entered the establishment closest to the escalator, not least because he was attracted by the music playing there. The cafe was small, but quite cozy. The interior was dominated by purple and blue tones. On the walls hung curious paintings, made in the form of engravings, which depicted scenes from the life of the ancient Greeks. Having taken a free table, the inspector looked around. Besides him, there were two young people in the room who looked like Portuguese tourists. One of them was curly-haired and gloomy, the other, on the contrary, red-faced and talkative. They sat across from each other and played XS and OS on a newspaper marked with a black marker in a 6x6 format. Sometimes these guys raised their heads and, exchanging short phrases in Portuguese, glanced in his direction. Galbraith began to look for the waiter. Finally, he saw a man walking slowly around the tables with some kind of tray. Having called out to him, the inspector involuntarily noticed that this man stood out strongly against the background of the interior. It was just strange to see in this room with a carefree atmosphere this tall and completely bald man, whose face seemed to be carved from granite. He was dressed simply and neatly, black trousers and a white shirt. Galbraith would not have focused so much on these details if this man gave his face, if not a smile, then at least just calm indifference, but instead the waiter's face was distorted by some kind of terrible grimace, as if he looked at every visitor as if he were a concentration camp prisoner who would soon be sent to the gas chamber. The bald spot only deepened this impression, although the inspector understood that even if this waiter had thick shoulder-length hair, his face would still remain the same. When the inspector's call reached the ears of this person, he turned to Galbraith's table and slowly walked up to him, after which, freezing 2 steps away from him, stared at the policeman with his own eyes. The inspector had suspicions that this guy clearly had problems with his gallbladder. "Does this place serve coffee?" asked Galbraith, who wanted to relax at a table and drink his favorite drink. The waiter, who continued to hold the plastic tray in his hands, did not answer. He only glared at the guest. The inspector involuntarily noticed that the pink color of the tray in the hands of this maypole involuntarily gave his entire appearance a resemblance to a Greek statue on which some jokers had put a skirt and bra. "I understand correctly that there is no coffee," said Galbraith, who was tired of enduring this unblinking gaze. "No coffee," the waiter repeated his last words. His voice sounded incredibly hoarse. The words seemed to come not from a human mouth, but from the speaker of a broken radio. The intonation like that of an automate only aggravated this feeling. "Could I see menu please?" asked the inspector, who realized that talking to this waiter was like talking to a shoebox. The waiter placed the tray directly on his table and walked towards the counter. Galbraith involuntarily began to look at the contents of the tray. There was an empty teacup with a teaspoon sticking out of it, a saucer with bread crumbs and 2 crumpled napkins. Apparently, this should have been taken to the car wash, but the inspector unwittingly interfered with the waiter. Galbraith thought that the service in this cafe was simply disgusting, because he had never seen dirty dishes from a previous client being put on a new guest. "They say, my hands are full, let him stand." Finally, the waiter returned to his table. He placed an A4 sheet of cardboard folded in the middle in front of the inspector and finally took away this impartial tray. Galbraith took the cardboard sheet in his hands. Yes, the selection in this cafe was small: the black tea, croissant without filling, some sweets, no indication, just sweets, and water. The inspector involuntarily glanced at the Portuguese sitting at the table. Now he understood why, instead of ordering food, they simply played XS and OS, because rather than pay money for this, it's better to sit hungry. Galbraith finally decided to order a cup of tea, not so much because he was very thirsty, he just thought that if he sat just like that, without food, then this gloomy waiter would decide to throw him out. They say, "Why are you sitting here if you don't order anything?" "Can I have some black tea please?" the inspector shouted to the waiter, who, having gotten rid of the tray, returned empty-handed. Bald Maple, nodding barely noticeably, left somewhere again. Galbraith had to wait 10 minutes until his order was finally placed in front of him, a small teacup, 2/3 full of a drink, not much different in color from coffee. He raised the cup to his mouth and took a sip. The first feeling was that a tea bag was dipped into cold water and left for a day. Barely suppressing the urge to spit out this slop, he put the cup on the table and, sighing, stared at the ceiling. He didn't know how long he sat there, but when two Portuguese stood up from the table and walked past him towards the exit, he finally woke up and looked at his watch. Oh no, there's only a little time left before boarding the plane. Galbraith got up from the table, on which the almost untouched tea continued to stand. The inspector ran to the escalator, trying not to throw off the little children running back and forth. Finally, he reached the security check area. The tedious procedure has begun. In front of beautiful young girls, a 31-year-old man had to take off his shoes and pull out his belt from his trousers. Galbraith involuntarily felt like an exhibitionist in a club for a representative of the womanhood. When these metal checks are finally over, he, trying to direct the blood flow back to the head, got into the relegation zone. Finally, Galbraith exhaled, "Here is the boarding gate." Having gone down the stairs with other passengers, he found himself on the street and, shivering from the cold, the wind was blowing, entered the bus, which, after traveling a few meters, stopped next to the Boeing. The ticket, which the inspector bought 2 weeks before the flight, was suspiciously cheap, and when Galbraith finally found himself inside this metal machine, then he understood why. He got a seat right at the very end of the plane, and right in the aisle. As a result, not only were his feet constantly being crushed by those going to the toilet, but he was also deprived of the pleasure of looking out the window. Well, okay, Galbraith thought, fastening his seatbelts. As a policeman who serves the people, his fate is to endure all sorts of inconveniences for the sake of this very people. On the left hand of the inspector sat some old man in a bowler hat who immediately began to doze at the porthole, and a skinny young guy, who, huddled in a chair, looked straight ahead. He looked no more than 19, 21 at most. The veins on his arms were so visible that it looked like he had transparent skin. Galbraith thought that this guy must be flying an airplane for the first time, so much uncertain appearance was at this yesterday's schoolboy. The inspector made himself more comfortable in his chair and wanted to read something, but remembering that his suitcase was in the luggage compartment, he abandoned this thought and, in order to at least occupy himself with something, began to look out the window. Unfortunately, nothing was visible behind the dozing old man. Galbraith sighed and followed the example of the skinny guy, simply staring at the back of his chair. He didn't know how much time had passed since the plane took off. His thoughts were focused on the operation for which he was sent on this flight. Although, since sounded a little wrong, in fact, he volunteered for this job himself, Portland Police Bureau just made an effort to help him in this case, but the management itself kept in mind that in this outburst of Galbraith, feelings prevailed over logic, therefore the success of the operation, one might even say in its usefulness, no one took it seriously except Galbraith himself. Sitting like that in his seat, he noticed with his peripheral vision how a flight attendant walked past him, carrying a cart with cold drinks. The inspector raised his head and began to watch as the woman stopped at each passenger and, taking out disposable cups, filled them with one drink or another and gave them to the person asking. Galbraith wanted to ask for water, he felt his throat was dry. But just as he was about to open his mouth, the sight of that terrible tea that he was served in the Portland International Airport's cafe suddenly flashed before his eyes. The sight of a cup filled with black liquid was so disgusting that he gave up the idea of asking the flight attendant for water. Therefore, when she turned in his direction, on her question, "What will you drink?" he just silently shook his head, thinking about what he could endure until London. Then the woman turned to the thin guy, but he also just silently shook his head. Galbraith couldn't resist but think that this guy was imitating him. Then the old man woke up and, shaking his head as frightened birds usually do, asked the flight attendant for wine. Alcohol on a plane, the inspector asked himself in bewilderment. Imagine his surprise when the flight attendant not only did not ask the passenger to change his decision, but, on the contrary, took a glass bottle that stood somewhere in the middle of the cardboard packages with juice and, pouring white wine into a plastic cup, handed it to the old man, who greedily extended his hand. Galbraith watched as he downed a small 200 milliliters cup in one gulp and, grunting with pleasure, stuck it between the chairs. After consuming this drink, all sleep immediately disappeared from the old man for a while, and he, smiling, turned to the inspector. "Hey, don't you think it looks very nice?" The old man was clearly in a good mood. "Well, I'm just sitting, flying, not touching anyone." Galbraith didn't really want to talk, but he couldn't ignore his fellow traveler. "Fabelhaft," the old man exclaimed in German. Then, glancing out the porthole, he turned to him again. "In what kind of cases are you flying on?" the old man said with attention. "By personal," Galbraith answered dryly. "Don't tell this gaffer that a police inspector is sitting near to him," he thought to himself. The old man again uttered a joyful exclamation in German and, having said a couple of good words about the wine, dozed off again at the porthole. Galbraith only now noticed that while he was talking with the old man, the young guy continued to sit silently, pressed into a chair. He immediately started guessing either this guy is mentally ill or he's just got his head in the clouds right now, not just heavenly, but narcotic. Having uttered the word narcotic to himself, Galbraith suddenly noticed a fleeting resemblance between the dozing old man and the doppelganger he had seen on the Portland subway, before death of his friend Farkraut. The similarities included, but were not limited to, the old man's arm hanging from the chair, as well as the fact that, apparently under the influence of alcohol, his lower jaw began to drop down. True, unlike that mysterious vision, it was clear from this old man that he just dozed off, when Doppelganger on the contrary gave the impression of sleeping like the dead. Giving himself up to these thoughts, Galbraith did not pay attention to how the flight was already coming to an end. A blue light came on in the cabin, and the inspector experienced a strange sensation. The internal organs seemed to jump inside his body, as if he were falling from a great height into the abyss. When the plane finally landed, from the invisible to the passengers' speakers the voice of the pilot was heard, who said, so that people would not rush to get up from their chairs, but Galbraith was tired of sitting. He did not get up, but, contrary to the order, unfastened his seatbelt, which was precisely what was forbidden to do. After a long 10 minutes, the same voice, distorted by the speakers, finally deigned to tell the passengers that the pilot was saying goodbye to them and wishing them all the best. The inspector got up, but it was far from the exit, because he was sitting at the very back of the plane. Then he had to spend extra time moving forward one step at a time, trying not to hurt the others. Galbraith could not help but feel as if he were a stone that was slowly being carried along the river, with the only difference being that the river was alive and had a motley color, and the stone, being also a living creature, felt tired and was angry. When he finally approached the exit of the plane, the flight attendant standing next to him smiled and said, "We are always at your service." The inspector involuntarily glanced at her. He thought how tired this pretty girl must have been of standing like that in a cramped space for almost 12 hours a day, and with all her being expressing to complete strangers her readiness to fulfill their requests. Yes, it's good that men are not hired as flight attendants. Galbraith himself personally would not have been able to stand wearing a mask of lies all day, pretending that he was not indifferent to some people with whom at any other time he would not even shake hands, let alone fulfill their whims. Stepping out onto the ramp, he involuntarily let out a sigh of relief. It was nice to finally be in the fresh air. While going down, he noticed that the sky was overcast with clouds. He frowned with displeasure. There was absolutely nothing good about getting caught in the rain and getting wet immediately upon arriving in another country, and since Galbraith did not take an umbrella with him, these were more than justified concerns. Then followed a long and tedious fuss at London Heathrow Airport. the inspector didn't even want to focus his thoughts on this anyway. All he had to do was follow the crowd of other passengers and repeat their actions. Therefore, he turned on his brains only when, already with a suitcase in his hands, he stood at the exit from the airport. Galbraith looked around for a taxi. It's good that on this day, even despite the weather, there was a crowd at the entrance. The inspector moved forward, and soon enough he saw a man standing next to his car and smoking a cigarette. "Hello," began Galbraith, approaching him, "can you take me to the state of Snow Lake?" The taxi driver immediately got into the car. The inspector put the suitcase on the next chair and made himself comfortable. "Do you mean the hotel on Queensborough Terrace?" asked the driver, turning on the ignition. "Yes," Galbraith answered briefly. The taxi began to slowly leave the airport. The inspector wondered what this hotel would be like, in which his dear gentleman patrons from the Portland Police Bureau had booked a room. "Why did you choose such a lousy hotel?" Suddenly a hoarse voice was heard. Galbraith shuddered, but it was just a taxi driver who, still keeping his hands on the steering wheel, winked at him in the rearview mirror. This sudden question of his pulled the inspector out of the whirlpool of his thoughts, and for a while he stopped thinking about his problems. "Lousy? What do you mean?" The inspector was surprised. "When you booked a hotel, didn't you look at its rating?" The driver seemed to be reproaching his passenger. "Well, I looked at only the price." Galbraith waved him off. "He didn't choose this hotel." The taxi driver, having heard his answer, launched into loud spatial reflections regarding the fact that Mr. Foreigner had made a mistake, and he said this with the intonation with which a teacher scolds a guilty student. Galbraith is tired of listening to this expatiation. "I don't like tourists," he replied in a familiar tone. "And if this hotel is as bad as you say, it means that I will essentially be alone there." "Oh, you misanthrope," his interlocutor answered almost with a fatherly intonation. Galbraith couldn't help but laugh at this definition. The taxi driver also followed suit, and the conversation stopped for a while. After 5 minutes of silence, the taxi driver, without taking his hands off the steering wheel, sniffled. The inspector saw in the rear-view mirror how a grin appeared on the man's wrinkled face. "I think I guessed why you chose this hotel," he said in a knowing tone. "Well, why?" Galbraith asked curiously. "According to the advertising brochures, then in one of his rooms stopped a certain person." And the London driver named the name of one writer, which was well known to everyone who had been interested in American literature at least once in their life. His passenger scratched his mustache and shook his head. The taxi driver took this as a sign that Galbraith allowed him to continue the babbling. He sighed noisily, and after a short pause said, "I completely agree with you." At the same time he smiled. "Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean." Galbraith didn't understand. "I'm talking about," the driver interrupted him, "that this paper shifter doesn't honor to the hotel to which I am taking you now." There was genuine resentment in the man's voice. "That is not what I said," protested Galbraith, who was already starting to get tired of the driver's tone. "I would even say that he only disgraces this establishment, exacerbating the already low level of service." The taxi driver spoke louder and louder. "Just keep calm, for God's sake," the passenger asked without much hope. "Because this is not a writer," the man behind the wheel was already shouting. "This is a businessman. He just hit the mother lode, and he doesn't care about the level of education of his readership." As much as possible, the inspector, listening to this expatiation, wiped the sweat from his forehead. On the contrary, he indulges the basest instincts of the most primitive and backward sectors of the population. "You will see this for yourself now." The driver didn't let up. Galbraith realized that it was pointless to try to calm this Englishman, who imagined that he knew a lot about writers better than all the members of the League of American Writers combined. So the policeman simply assumed an indifferent look and leaned his head back on the seat. "Just listen," the taxi driver spoke in the tone of a strict teacher. "What did I read on the very first page of his book?" White bitch had taken it in the mouth again. With barely restrained rage he quoted to the entire interior of the car. At these words, Galbraith involuntarily opened his eyes. "Please, don't use bad language," he tried to shame the man. But the interlocutor ignored his words. On the very first page, first, as if reading out a court verdict, the taxi driver continued excitedly. "Taking that book in my hands, I was going to get some food for thought, but its pages greeted me with the slang of ill-mannered teenagers." His passenger, who was gradually beginning to be amused by these shouts, looked up at the driver's seat. "One might think," he began in a calm tone, "that you expected from the mystical horror genre something sublime and refined." Having said this, the inspector yawned and stared out the window. "Expected," the driver yelled. "This has got to be usual state of affairs. Do you know the writer Lem?" He suddenly turned to the passenger. "Lem," Galbraith said thoughtfully. He began to turn over in his head the names of all those whom he had read in his youth. No one with that last name came to his mind. "I repeat, does the name of Lem mean anything to you?" The driver's eyes blinked several times. He might even get a heart attack, thought the inspector, and he felt embarrassed. "Well," he began, "I read the novel Motley's by a writer with a similar surname, certain Steiner Lem." In fact, it was a lie, he had never picked up such a book, he had only seen its title on one of the Norwegian bestseller lists. The driver turned back to the steering wheel. The dissatisfied sniffle he made convinced Galbraith that the old man did not like his answer at best, and at worst was perceived as an affront. But he finally stopped having literary debates with the passenger. Apparently, the fact that the inspector knew the namesake of his favorite writer allowed the taxi driver to feel some respect for him. This was confirmed by the man's slightly animated look, as well as by the fact that the next 15 minutes of the trip from the London Heathrow Airport to the Hotel State of Snow Lake building passed in complete silence. When the car brought the police inspector to its destination, the taxi driver pressed the brake and leaned out of the window. After admiring the two women walking towards him for a few seconds, the old man's face lit up and he said triumphantly, £90 sterling. His passenger nodded silently and took out the money. "That's it, I brought you to this pigsty." After payment, the taxi driver said in a sympathetic tone. "Do you feel sorry for me?" Galbraith asked him cheerfully, pulling the suitcase out of the car. "Not really." After a pause, the man said. The inspector got out of the car and was about to close the door, but the driver, again sticking his head out of the window, looked up at him. "If you don't like this hotel, then don't be angry that I brought you there." There was a pleading in his words. "Think nothing of it," said the inspector even more cheerfully. He waved to the driver, who was already driving away. Then he turned on his heel and, sighing, looked at the building. The first thing that caught Galbraith's eye was the sign hanging above the door, a simple rectangular wooden plate painted white. On it was written in thick red letters, "State of Snow Lake." A tourist from Portland couldn't help but think that this sign must have been drawn by the hotel owner's child, the letters were so clumsy. Not a good start for today, flashed through his mind. Galbraith pulled the door towards himself and stepped over the threshold. There was only one person in the cool check-in area, no longer young men in a well-worn frock coat. He stood behind an unassuming-looking counter and looked boredly fingering the playing cards lying in front of him. However, at the sight of Galbraith entering, he immediately abandoned this activity and stood at attention in front of the guest. "Good morning, and welcome to our hotel," the receptionist shouted in an incredibly solemn tone and saluted. Looking at this, the inspector thought that this man had apparently served in the army before. There was some kind of agility in him, which could be an echo of the young years spent on the military parade ground. Involuntarily contemplating the receptionist, Galbraith almost forgot about it, that he needs to be given a booking slip. With this thought, the guest put the suitcase on the floor and pulled out his wallet. When the old man in a frock coat took a small piece of paper from Galbraith's hands and unfolded it in his hands, lights seemed to light up in his eyes. He began to study this nondescript piece of paper with such curiosity, what the inspector involuntarily thought, that was indicated there not some dull data about the room and check-in dates, but all of him, Galbraith, is the ins and outs. What was missing, he thought, was for the receptionist to suddenly refuse to let him check in. Fortunately, this did not happen. "Can I see your documents?" The receptionist looked up Galbraith. The inspector's heart felt lighter. He gave the man his blue, with gold letters passport. The receptionist took it in his hands. When he opened it, the mischievous lights lit up in his eyes again. The old man in the frock coat opened the first page, and, running his eyes over it, suddenly turned to Galbraith. "Well, you're like the prodigal son," he said as if he had made an unexpected discovery. "I'm embarrassed to ask what," the inspector said in bewilderment. "You changed your place of residence to America, but now you have returned to the bosom of your homeland," the receptionist continued. "Oh, yes, the column place of birth." Galbraith began to search for words. He, of course, understood that the hotel receptionist's words were just a joke, but it seemed to the inspector that it was better to play it safe and explain himself to this man, on whom where he would spend the night in this country would depend. "You see, I just couldn't find a job in Gloucester in my field, so I decided to move abroad." Galbraith began to make excuses confusedly. It wasn't until he said it that it dawned on him how stupid that excuse was. After all, if the interlocutor had decided to inquire about what field he could be talking about, then it could bubble to the surface that Galbraith is actually the inspector of Portland's police, and then incognito would have collapsed. But fortunately for him, the receptionist was satisfied with this answer, and, having returned the passport to the owner, he turned around and began rummaging through the lockers. Galbraith, taking advantage of the fact that the old man turned his back to him, allowed himself to wipe the sweat that had appeared on his forehead from excitement. "Here, take the room key." The receptionist turned back. The inspector accepted a nondescript-looking key with a key fob from his hands. The old man in a frock coat began to say something about the peculiarities of living in their hotel, talked about the cleaning schedule, changing towels and much more, but Galbraith, who felt tired, ignored his words. The only thing he remembered was that since he rented a room only, he would have to eat outside the hotel. "How much all this jazz cost?" said Galbraith, opening his wallet. The receptionist, taking out a calculator, told the guest that for one night at the State of Snow Lake Hotel they pay about £60. Galbraith waited patiently while the old man, who didn't wear glasses, poked at the buttons on the electronic device. In the end, the amount that this little device brought out was about £450. Not bad, the inspector thought, putting a thick stack of bills on the counter. The receptionist took the money with lightning speed and, without even counting it, put it in his pocket. A crazy thought flashed through Galbraith's head about how much of this money would be spent on the hotel itself, and not on the entertainment of the old man himself. Then the receptionist came out from behind the counter and beckoned the guest to follow him. As they walked towards the stairs, Galbraith could not help but think that if his patrons from the Portland Police Bureau were aware of life in London, they probably would not have booked him a room in this hotel, which by its very appearance signaled that the person who ended up here needed to be on guard. "We don't have an elevator, so go upstairs on your own," the receptionist said unctuously. The old man in the frock coat pointed towards the stairs with an inviting gesture and, pretending that he did not see Galbraith's displeased look, returned to the check-in area. The inspector's dissatisfaction was that he, tired after the flight, was not ready to drag his suitcase up the steps. After watching the receptionist go, Galbraith began to go upstairs, reassuring himself that he was, after all, a policeman, not an ox girl. Having reached the 4th floor and taking a breath, he opened the door to his room. From what was revealed to his gaze, Galbraith was, to put it mildly, not happy. It was enough to look at the shabby bedside table to understand that the administrator clearly did not spend a pound on updating the furniture in the rooms. It only got worse. Having taken off his jacket, the inspector was about to put his suitcase on a chair, but imagine his surprise when it turned out that there was not a single representative of this important piece of furniture in the room. Therefore, with annoyance, he had to put the suitcase on the shoe bench. Furthermore, all the lampshades hanging on the ceiling were covered with such a thick layer of rust that it seemed as if they were exhibit from the Iron Age. The inspector went to the bathroom, which was combined with a toilet. He noted with dissatisfaction that the walls of the toilet were covered with a red coating. When he wanted to lock the shabby wooden door, he had to be very careful, because the latch almost did not hold and, it seemed, could fall to the floor at any second. Galbraith did his dirty work and, having rinsed himself off, was about to go out, but the door stuck. He fought for almost 3 minutes with the latch, which seemed to have a mind of its own and did not want to let out the man who had betrayed his homeland for the sake of life in das gelobte Land. When the jammed latch finally deigned to make concessions to the human and released the inspector to freedom, Galbraith was already so tired that he did not unpack his things, but immediately went to the bed. Having undressed, he reached under the blanket and noticed with irritation that the sheet was burned by a cigarette, and the duvet cover had a hole. Pulling the blanket over himself, he thought about asking tomorrow for his bed linen to be changed. Be that as it may, the inspector was so tired after the flight that as soon as he closed his eyes, he immediately fell asleep. In his dream, Galbraith found himself in a room somewhat similar to a hotel in a country cottage, a well-furnished room with many pieces of furniture, of which the carpets on the walls immediately caught his eye, a shelf with antique sabers, a huge wardrobe with books, decorated with stucco, a fireplace, in which for some reason there was a crumpled sheet of paper lying around, and one window, curtained so thickly that the only source of light in the room was a small stearine candle standing on the lacquered top of the table, at which Galbraith himself sat on a simple wooden chair. Opposite him he saw Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore, who was dressed in a cream-colored sweater, under which one could see the collar of a white shirt, decorated with a silk tie. He kept his hands under the table, making his whole figure seem stooped, although Scaymore was far from a frail man, which slightly confused Galbraith, who looked straight into the interlocutor's face, but the weak candlelight did not make it possible to properly examine the features of his face. For some time the two of them sat motionless opposite each other, intently peering into each other's eyes. In the silence that stood in this place, some vague tension was felt, as if each of the interlocutors was about to attack the other, but could not decide. When the quiet became completely unbearable, Galbraith turned his gaze to the wall where hung the antique sabers and daggers, not because he was going to take possession of the weapon, but because he wanted to break this onerous eye contact for a minute. But suddenly, as if noticing this movement of his eyeballs, Mr. Chief Inspector gave his voice, and Galbraith had to look up at his interlocutor again. From the height of my life experience, Scaymore began in his usual impartial tone, I see how far you are from the true state of affairs. If you don't mind, I'll share with you some of my thoughts regarding your challenge. The soft, senile voice of Mr. Chief Inspector had a calming effect on Galbraith. For a while, he began to trust him, completely forgetting how suspicious the place where the two of them were at the moment was. The inspector did not object to Scaymore's words and, without further questions, accepted his proposal with silent submission. The case you are currently investigating, the interlocutor continued, has an unusual purview. The question it poses goes far beyond methodological and legal problems. I believe that the issues involved in this case are in an area that the police most often do not think about. At these words he paused. Galbraith, listening to Scaymore, only now noticed that the facial muscles of his interlocutor never contracted, despite the stream of words spewed from his lips. Cheeks, cheekbones and lips of Mr. Chief Inspector were completely motionless, as if he had not spoken at all. Galbraith tried to look at his eyes in order to understand something, but the darkness in the room hid everything except the trembling pale light of a candle, the light of which allowed him to see only the surface of the table and the jaws of the sitting on the other side man. It's about faith, continued Mr. Chief Inspector. But not the Lord God, as you might think, and a delinquent. This estimation of Scaymore was so inconsistent with the usual worldview of his interlocutor that Galbraith immediately wanted to ask the question that had been on his tongue from the very beginning of their conversation. But as soon as he tried to open his mouth, he suddenly noticed with horror that his tongue seemed to stuck to the sky and he cannot make a sound. Galbraith immediately fell into a panic, not understanding what was happening. And the senile voice continued to be heard from behind the tightly closed lips of Mr. Chief Inspector, which gave the impression that it was not a live voice, but a recording on a magnetic tape, played by Invisible in the Darkness cassette recorder. Dr. Baselard committed a crime, Skemore continued. I admit that this is an irrefutable fact. But has the thought ever occurred to you that he did his deed for your own sake? Just like a whale cannot live in the ocean without planktons, so a policeman cannot exist in a society without a perpetrator. Galbraith felt uneasy from these words. To the panic that gripped him was added an irrational feeling of shame, as if he was uncomfortable with the fact that, as it turned out, the whole world revolved around his modest person, even if it was a world of cruds and criminals. Looking away from his interlocutor, he suddenly noticed that the curtain hanging in front of the window was sticking out a little forward, as if it was pulled over a large object, the size of a man. With his eyes bulging, Galbraith peered into the curtain for several seconds, and although he was unable to see the exact outlines in the darkness, the thought immediately arose in his head that, in addition to him and Mr. Chief Inspector, there was another person in the room, who for the time being did not decide to show himself on the eyes. There must exist in the world constabulary and coffins, before whom they are obliged to perform their service, Skemore's even voice came. In the crime of Dr. Baselard lies your serenity, and in his person, salvation. As if in response to these words, the curtains moved, and Galbraith saw the silhouette of a short and fat man flash in the darkness. The unknown person immediately stood behind Skemore, and the inspector saw a familiar jacket and trousers, albeit somewhat blurred in the dark, the same ones that Dr. Baselard was wearing at the moment when he found him at the entrance. But Galbraith was in no hurry to admit that this strange subject was the doctor, because, apart from the same garments, this man did not give the impression of an old and shabby man. On the contrary, under the clothes one could discern a strong, muscular body, and the stranger's movements were filled with energy. And that's why you'll never catch him, Mr. Chief Inspector continued. After all, with his capture, your own existence will come to its logical end. And there is no mistake in my words, the whole thing about the young lady who died after Dr. Baselard's surgery is not so much an event of the present as a harbinger of the future. More precisely, it's the omen, he emphasized the last words. Galbraith wanted to ask whether Mr. Chief Inspector himself understood what exactly is the omen with Delia's death was, but at the same moment the stranger sharply jerked his hand, and Skemore's head separated from his neck. But it could not be called beheading, because decapitation is possible only with a living creature, while in place of the Mr. Chief Inspector's neck, instead of an obvious bloody wound, the smooth surface of polished wood glistened. And when the head itself, instead of falling to the floor, began to perform intricate pirouettes in the air, it became clear to Galbraith that the stranger had pulled the lever of the crane, to which the head was attached by an invisible in the darkness nylon line. However, there was no time to reflect on what was happening. The wooden head of Mr. Chief Inspector flew madly across the room, threatening to hit anyone who gets in her way, while a headless mannequin in a Skemore's suit disappeared from the chair with the sound of a timber falling to the floor. Left alone with the stranger still hidden in the darkness, Galbraith could not help but feel a certain timidity and even something like respect in front of him, in any case, for organizing this whole affair with an artificial dummy of a Mr. Chief Inspector and a tape recording of his speech. It was completely unclear why, and, most importantly, for whom all this was being done, but Galbraith considered it unnecessary to ask about it. Still he could not utter a word, because his tongue did not obey him. Trying to get up from the table, he almost lost his balance and suddenly noticed how a ligneous Skemore's head flew over the table and hit the candle standing on it. At that very second the flame went out, and the room became truly dark. Waking up the next day, Galbraith was involuntarily taken aback when he saw around him, instead of his native apartment, the unaccustomed interior of a State of Snow Lake hotel, but this was only a fleeting moment of confusion. Pondering his nightmare, he decided that the phantasmagorical nature of his events was explained by the fact that the human brain, after flying from one continent to another, adapted to new conditions in order to be ready to perceive everything that it would have to face in an essentially unfamiliar country. The first thing Galbraith wanted to do after sleep was to wash himself and brush his teeth. He started to go to the bathroom, but remembering that he had forgotten to take out his toothbrush since yesterday, he went to his suitcase with some annoyance. Having opened it, the inspector squatted down and began rummaging through its contents. The item he was looking for turned out to be at the very depths of the suitcase. Taking out a toothbrush, Galbraith involuntarily drew attention to a stack of white sheets. It was the materials on the case of his friend Farkraut, which he conducted before his death. Sighing, the policeman took the papers out of his suitcase and, putting them on the desk, went to get himself in order. After washing himself, Galbraith left the bathroom, wiping his face with a towel as he walked. Looked at the desk again. Yes, he thought, I've been putting off reading this document all this time. He hung the towel on the doorknob and, taking a stack of papers in his hands, stretched out on the bed, because there was nowhere to sit in this hotel room. The inspector began to read this magnum opus for the first time since its author personally handed it to Galbraith in the office of Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore. On the first pages there was a short introduction in which Farkraut indicated that he was led to the topic of the investigation by the words of the cult urologist Japhet Burns, friend and colleague of Jordan Thurlow. The point was that when the inspector interrogated Mr. Burns about his harassment of a certain Delia, daughter of pharmaceutist Yonce, he denied everything, but Farkraut remembered how, during interrogation, Japhet admitted that on that fateful day he wrote down a few words from the little girl in his notebook. When the inspector asked for what purposes, Mr. Burns, after a little hesitation, admitted to the policeman that in his opinion, for people who have Greek names, life always turns out in a rather sad way. When Farkraut asked for an example, Japhet replied that the inspector would simply need to go through the list of deaths to see that among the dead there were a lot of people with names of Greek origin. After reading these lines, Galbraith could not help but notice that Mr. Burns apparently had the makings of a person working with statistics, and wondered why he, despite everything, decided to choose the profession of cult urologist and not go, for example, to a market research institute where he could direct his abilities in the right direction. Galbraith's thoughts returned to Farkraut, with whom he had studied together at the Portland Police Academy and even shared the same dorm room. Drawing parallels with Jordan Thurlow's colleague, the inspector couldn't help but remember that his own friend's fate was much the same. Since childhood, Farkraut dreamed of becoming a writer, and he became a policeman because he concluded that if he writes some book, and readers say that his work offends some of their feelings, then barely literate to the end life cannot wash away the shame. In the context of this, Galbraith recalled an episode from their student life. One Sunday afternoon, Farkraut, alone with him in his favorite cafe, began to tell his friend about how, while still a student at the University of Portland, where he entered precisely in order to study to be a writer, for the credit he wrote a story based on Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Galbraith still remembered the contents of his friend's work, although he didn't even pick it up. But sometimes it happens that a work told out loud sinks into the soul much more powerfully than something read by the person himself. This was the case with Farkraut's story, which the failed writer gave the somewhat immodest and pretentious name Dorian read. In fact, it was a curious reworking of that part of the book where James Vane returns from Australia to England. Farkraut, using the same characters of the great Irish playwright, forced them to act according to his plot. According to the plan of the future American inspector, when James Vane disembarks from a ship in an English port, he is immediately recruited into the headquarters of the revolutionaries, who, in order to test sailors' abilities, give him the task of killing Dorian Gray, who, as stated in the original work, had the reputation of a famous hedonist among young people. As in the original, James Vane is accidentally killed by the bullet of Sir Geoffrey Clouston, brother of Duchess Monmouth. But what followed this moment had a rather strange continuation, which was completely inconsistent with the events that took place on the pages of the original work. Death of Sybil Vane's brother does not get away with Sir Geoffrey Clouston, as it was planned by the classic of English literature. In the reworking of The American Student, this, on the contrary, causes a strong reaction among those who recruited James Vane. As Farkraut wrote, the workers organize an ambush on the road along which brother of Duchess Monmouth was traveling to his misfortune. The revolutionaries attack Sir Geoffrey Clouston's carriage and, having killed the owner, going to London. This news quickly reaches the English aristocrats, who, realizing that this is the omen of uprising from the proletarian class, decide to unleash the entire police force on the rioters. Meanwhile, the ringleaders of the rebellion are already arriving in the metropolis and going to the working-class neighborhoods, where they call on people to take to the streets and go to the main square. Soon all the labor of London are heading there in an avalanche, simultaneously burning everything in their path with the fire of revolution. Farquhar ended his story with the fact that Dorian Gray, looking at how the capital was burning in flames, decides that he does not want to die at the hands of the workers and, as in the original work, runs to the attic, where he sticks a knife into the portrait and dies. Galbraith was then amazed that how his friend even think of finding revolutionary overtones in the novel, which was essentially a hymn to hedonism. Farquhar responded that the teachers at the University of Portland were also at a loss when he presented them with the manuscript of this story for credit. Only their surprise resulted in the fact that the next day the student was expelled from the alma mater in disgrace under the pretext that his work was propaganda of communism. Farquhar said that with his story he wanted to convey the idea of when the death of some inconspicuous person, in his case, the unfortunate sailor James Vane, leads to something global. But alas, in the heads of the teachers, as the future inspector bitterly noted, there seemed to be only thoughts about looking for subtext associated with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics even where it actually does not exist. Galbraith involuntarily remembered that in 1981, when he actually entered the police academy, the Soviet Union was still a serious threat to the rest of the world, and the feeling that the next day would not come due to a possible nuclear strike sometimes haunted a man in those early days. The inspector was still lying in bed, his legs thrown over the headboard. Despite the fact that he had intended to read the papers on the Farquhar's case, he couldn't help but think about their author himself. Yes, Galbraith thought, I'm only 31 years old, but sclerosis is already progressing. Suddenly he felt a sharp feeling of hunger. The last time he ate, if a sip of tea can be called a meal, still in America, at Portland International Airport. The policeman, with some reluctance, lowered his feet to the floor and, sitting on the bed, accidentally dropped the sheets of paper on the floor. I've become a total wreck, he thought to himself again. Galbraith sank to the floor, the papers, which, not being fastened together, scattered in all directions. He began to collect them, but since he did not know their order, he simply took one sheet after another and, having collected them all in one pile, put it on the desk. At the end of this task, he exhaled. It was not very easy for him to climb on the floor for papers, and headed to the window, curtained with tulle curtains. Moving them aside, Galbraith came close to the window sill and began to look at the urban landscape spread out under the window. He looked at the cars passing on the road. In the morning sun they looked as if they were cast from some shiny material. The inspector couldn't even find words, he was so fascinated by this spectacle. He couldn't understand why this ordinary sight attracted him so much. It was probably because the cars he saw in Portland bore little resemblance to those driving on the streets of London. Looking at the traffic, Galbraith suddenly caught himself thinking that he had involuntarily perceived the street as a toy table, and the figures of cars, for toys that drive at the will of an invisible child who switches the buttons on the radio remote control. Perhaps the reason could be that the policeman had not yet fully woken up, and the movements of the cars, too fast for his sleepy eyes, looked ragged, without the smoothness usual for the real world. He eventually witnessed a truck crash into a red convertible. "That's it, kid, your car is broken, now you'll have to beg your dad to buy you a new toy," said Galbraith, as if addressing a child. The wrong meaning of his own words only dawned on him when the truck cab door suddenly opened and the driver jumped out. Only at this moment did Galbraith come to his senses from his trance and realized that what was in front of his eyes was not a simulation, but the real world, and that a real accident had actually happened below, not game with toy cars. Yes, Galbraith thought, I'll develop a god complex if I treat what's happening around me like that. On the other hand, what does he care about this accident? Yes, he is a servant of law and order, but of a completely different country. In London, he is essentially just an ordinary tourist, who has even fewer rights than any native Englishman. Galbraith hurriedly moved away from the window, It's one thing when cars are driving peacefully outside, and quite another when a tragedy unfolds on the road. As he remembered, the truck had destroyed almost the entire front part of the convertible, so Galbraith had great doubts that the poor fellow had managed to survive. The inspector got dressed and left the room into the corridor. He remembered that he had booked his room only, so willy-nilly he would have to eat in some restaurant. Not a big deal, Galbraith thought as he walked down the stairs. In this State of Snow Lake hotel he had already seen so many things that went beyond the norm that the mere thought that he would also try local food made him feel disgusted. Having gone downstairs, he left the hotel and, turning up the collar of his jacket, for, despite the sun, a cold wind was blowing here, he walked forward, not really understanding where the narrow streets of this quarter would lead him. The inspector noted with unpleasant surprise that a walk through the streets of London was a real test for his eardrums. The fact is that Galbraith was used to the fact that there weren't very many cars on the streets of Portland, and therefore the streets there were quite quiet. Here, it seemed, the air was simply filled with noise, and even in the alleys, where no major roads were visible, the sound of cars did not subside. He began to suspect that some kind of turbines were buried under the asphalt, because what else could be the source of the hum, not radiation, after all. As he wandered through the streets, he couldn't help thinking fondly about his room in that terrible hotel, for at least there he was in quiet. Galbraith was hungry, so he was in no hurry to go back, but after the streets of London the wretched room in the State of Snow Lake seemed to him in different colors. I'll come back, he thought, and will enjoy the silence. Suddenly Galbraith felt small drops begin to fall on him. He looked up and was involuntarily surprised. He did not expect at all that during the time he spent on his morning walk, clouds had already appeared in the sun. I need some shelter from the rain, the inspector thought, and in connection with this he involuntarily remembered how in Portland he got drunk in a bar to celebrate and then stood like a statue in the pouring rain. No, now getting wet in the rain was absolutely not an option. After all, he was at home there, but here is an unfamiliar country. Plus the hotel does not inspire respect. With these thoughts, Galbraith, not really understanding where his feet were taking him, entered the first door he came across. He managed to see the neon sign. It was written there Ursinus Orca Osteria. Looking at these thin pink letters, he noticed a lucky coincidence that just when it started to rain, he came across an establishment where he could have a bite to eat. The room where Galbraith went to hide from the rain was twilight. But this did not look like a deliberate stylistic decision by the owner of the osteria. A much more likely explanation for this darkness was the banal laziness of the proprietor to replace long burnt-out light bulbs. The inspector stopped at the threshold to look around. Suddenly the silence was broken by someone's very impudent voice. "Who is that has come upon us?" Clearly, as if in a public speaking course, said a man invisible to Galbraith. The inspector involuntarily shuddered. He turned his head in the direction where this indiscreet question came from. The source of these words turned out to be some middle-aged man with a beer belly. Galbraith involuntarily winced when he saw his torn jeans and green jacket stained with white paint stains. Fatso lounged on a chair and, leaning his right hand on the table, brought his free hand to his eyes to adjust his glasses, which, against the background of his fat face, looked frankly odd, like they were on a pig and not a human. "Somebody turn on the lights." "I do not see who is that has come," the bespectacled boor continued in the same tone. Galbraith was disgusted to hear this. He had a stupid feeling as if he had stepped onto the podium for this impartial person. He, barely restraining himself from breaking into this impudent guy, approached him and asked, "Are you enjoying watching me?" He tried to speak as calmly as possible, although inside he was seething with rage. Instead of answering, the man jumped up from his seat with unexpected agility for such a corpulent. "Whoa, take it easy," Galbraith said calmly, as if giving a command to an animal. "Hey, have you gone nuts?" The fatso slowly backed away, streams of sweat running down his face. "Why are you shouting at visitors like crazy?" the inspector asked him, continuing to approach. "I can do that, I'm the director of this establishment," the bespectacled boor said bravely. Galbraith heard footsteps behind him and immediately turned around. Behind him stood a mustachioed, middle-aged, thin waiter, whose eyes darted furtively around. He recoiled involuntarily as the stern-faced policeman stared straight at him. "Enough of that, stop," he the fatso yelled. "I certainly don't need for you to waste us all." "Well, you're right," the inspector readily agreed with him. Galbraith relaxed and sat down at the table where the director had previously sat. "What'll it be, sir?" the waiter said in a bleeding voice. "So, what's good here?" Galbraith answered a question with a question. He immediately did not like the unctuous notes of this old man, whom he was looking at with suspicion at that moment. Instead of answering, the waiter threw a menu on the table. The guest immediately thought that the service here was clearly not so good. But he did not leave the establishment. At the moment his stomach was dominated on his brain. Having opened the menu, the inspector began to carefully study it while the waiter continued to looking over his shoulder. While Galbraith was running his eyes over the list of dishes, two people entered the room of Ursinus Orca Osteria, a man and a woman. The inspector caught them out of the corner of his eye, but, being busy drawing up an order, did not particularly concentrate his attention on them. But he could not help but ignore the fact that both of these guests looked extremely unsightly. They both had messy long hair and their dirty black clothes looked like they were a couple sizes too big. Standing on the threshold, they, like mongrels, began to shake furiously all over their bodies, and drops of rainwater hanging on their clothes flew to the sides. By that time, Galbraith had already made his choice. He wanted something liquid and also something with meat. In the end, he settled on cream soup of fresh champignons and fettuccine with chicken and tomato. It's not that these were his favorite culinary preferences, he just decided that these were the most high-calorie dishes on the menu of this establishment. Galbraith told the waiter his order, and he nodded slightly and finally moved away from his table. The inspector wanted to breathe a sigh of relief, but then a couple of beggars suddenly made themselves known. They approached the bar, behind which stood the cashier, a man in the prime of his life with red sideburns on his cheeks. "Gimme proceeds," said a man with a puffy face and long black hair brazenly. "You will receive a reward for alms," bleated his girlfriend, dressed in such a large dress that it seemed as if she was wrapped in a shroud. Galbraith was disgusted to see this, but he couldn't help but become interested. After all, there was a time when people looked at freaks, he thought. "You're so brave," the cashier smiled. "Come on, get it." Wherein he made a strange hand gesture, as if he had an invisible wad of bills in his hand. The beggars repeated their request again, only this time the woman flirtatiously twirled her whole body in front of the cashier. "That's the last thing I need here," thought Galbraith. He had already begun to regret coming here, but he had to wait for the order, so he had no choice but to sit in the hall of Ursinus Orca Osteria, where some kind of circus of madmen was happening before his eyes. "We're having socks," the beggar maid suddenly shouted high. "No doubt, but what of that?" the cashier asked her in a flirtatious tone. "She wants sell socks to you," the pauper with a puffy face blurted out loudly, as if addressing a dumb kid. Well, thought the inspector, looking at this, selling clothes under the counter, probably also stolen. He was curious what next action the cashier with the red sideburns would take. Deep down, he hoped that he would going to knock their out of there. "Okay, I'm on it." "Show me the goods," said the cashier, scratching his prickly cheek. "And you gimme your leg," the beggar maid croaked. "Wait, what's this for?" asked the cashier, but from his tone it seemed like he didn't really mind. "She needs to understand what size you are," the pauper muttered again in an explanatory tone. While this scene was playing out at the counter, a waiter approached Galbraith. He placed a plate of cream soup of fresh champignons in front of the inspector and, nodding mockingly, left. Galbraith took the spoon and started eating. Not bad, he thought, not a culinary masterpiece, but not some kind of sandwich either. He ate and continued to watch the circus that was happening not far from his table. Man with red sideburns had already raised his leg straight up on the bar. The pauper told him to take off his shoe, and the cashier completely disappeared behind the counter. Apparently, he actually bent down to take off his shoes. What nonsense, Galbraith thought, having almost finished the soup. Here's your second order, he heard the waiter's voice. With these words, he placed a new dish in front of the inspector. Galbraith pushed away the now empty bowl of soup and, looking at what they brought him, stared at the waiter, who continued to stand nearby. What did you bring me? The inspector asked sternly, without a hint of a smile. Your order, what else? Mumbled the mustachioed man, whose eyes were spinning feverishly in their sockets. I ordered the fettuccine with chicken and tomato. And what did you give me? Galbraith continued without changing his tone. The plate that stood in front of him contained regular spaghetti, topped with tomato paste. There was no chicken visible there, although who knows, if he picked this dish with a fork, maybe he found a tiny piece of chicken skin at the very bottom. Please enter the venue, the waiter began in a vile, unctuous tone, whose eyes began to spin even faster. I don't care, the inspector began, but the waiter did not let him finish. The owner's son is now cooking in the kitchen, a wonderful boy, he is studying at culinary college, the thin man spoke hurriedly, almost drooling. Who makes my food there? Galbraith tried to get the word out. And so I ask you to be merciful to the boy, because this is his first day at work. It seemed like the waiter was about to fall to his knees. I paid you for this, the inspector pointed his finger at the plate, about £50 sterling. And I want to get what I ordered, not some sludge by relative of the owner of your establishment, Galbraith said firmly, glaring at the waiter with a stern look. With these words he stood up from the table and, glancing at the counter, where the cashier showed off to the beggars his leg, covered with mycosis blisters, resolutely moved towards the door. The waiter did not remain in debt, he scurried after Galbraith, like a cowardly jackal after a brave tiger. You did not like, the waiter said in a fawning tone. Yes, the inspector said loudly and firmly and pulled the door towards him. Wait, I get it no, yelled a man with shifty eyes. Already standing on the street, Galbraith turned around. He saw how the waiter, loudly stamping his feet, ran deeper into the room. Meanwhile, the cashier with red sideburns was returning the socks to the beggars. Apparently, he really tried them on, but they turned out to be the wrong size for him. Gods with them, these poor cruel folk, thought Galbraith, although he was a little interested what the waiter, who meanwhile had already disappeared into the kitchen, was going to know.